All right, guys. So, good evening, everyone. My name is Katie McCarter, and I am the Brock Environmental Center's Administrative Assistant. I'd like to take this time to introduce our lady behind the scenes, Alice Chrisman, who will be monitoring the chat and helping me out with the Q&A. We really appreciate you all signing in tonight. Yesterday was the first day of school for many families and teachers. And as CBS staff, we know doing everything virtually presents challenges. I first wanted to send a shout out to teachers and parents who are now teachers. It's not easy switching gears, as we all know. And if you need any additional resources, we're here to help. Our education department is working on several virtual tools that could help engage your kiddos in Bay-related topics. Actually, Alice is going to drop a link into the chat. The chat box is going to be located at the bottom of your screen, and that link is actually going to give you more information on the different types of videos, and also people to contact, some educators that if you have any additional questions, they're happy to kind of walk you through some of the stuff. We're really proud of this program and hope you actually utilize it, and hope you are as proud of it as we are. With that being said, most of us have spent a great deal of time on online webinars already today. So the fact that you see this as an important topic and more fun than work really makes my heart smile. So thank you guys so much for being here. And although it'd be nice to be back at the Brock Center and doing these presentations in person, the online versions have allowed us to open up the registration to the whole watershed and not just the Hampton Roads area, which is really kind of a cool thing that the pandemic has actually allowed us to do, is allowed us to kind of become more collaborative rather than just kind of be segmented into our separate locations along the watershed. So I'd like to take this time to welcome old friends and say hello to new ones. Grab a snack, grab a beverage of your choice, get cozy, and as Tanner Council likes to say, you got the best seat in the house. So let's go ahead and get started, and I'll just go over and talk about what we're going to be kind of presenting tonight. So farming for clean water. Farmers are a crucial partner in our restoration efforts for saving the bay. Nitrogen is one of the top 3 pollutants in our bay, and the farmers have the ability to reduce nitrogen pollution by as much as 60%. Tonight we'll be looking at best management practices to not only improve a farmer's bottom line, but also improve water quality in the creeks, rivers, and the bay. We have 2 CBF staff members that are going to be talking to us, and they're coming from the Shenandoah Valley. These 2 guys work hand in hand on a daily basis. There are boots on the ground when it comes to knowledge of farming, the farming industry, and implementing these best management practices. And in my opinion, there's no one better, but I realize I could be a little biased. First, we'll hear from Matt Kowalski. Matt is our CBF Virginia Watershed Restoration Scientist. Matt works on habitat restoration and focuses on opportunities to help farmers improve local water quality. He has a background in wildlife biology and takes ecosystem approach to addressing watershed restoration issues. Matt lives with his family in the beautiful Shenandoah Valley and enjoys a variety of outdoor activities that allow him to connect with nature. So before I hand it over to Matt, I kind of wanted just to go over a little basics of maintenance for webinars. Not like we're not all experts already at this stuff, but just go over it. So there's a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. If you have any questions at any point in time, please go ahead and enter that question into the Q&A. We will address all questions at the end of the presentation in the last 10 minutes or so. And also, there is a chat feature. The chat feature is going to be where Alice is going to be dropping some links for different kind of information if you're interested in it. So with that being said, we'll go ahead and I'll turn it over to Matt, and I'll go ahead and get the presentation shared. Hold on just a moment, please.
All right, thanks a lot for handing it over to me, Katie, and thanks for that great introduction. Hello, everyone, and like Katie said, thanks for coming tonight to participate in this. I'll start out by saying that this is the first one of these that I have done through the Brock Learning Center, and certainly the first webinar version of it that I've done. People have always told me that if you get nervous, try to picture your audience not wearing pants. And I think the pandemic may have ruined that for me because I can't imagine how many of you may or may not be wearing pants anyway. So I'm going to try to find some other way to cope, and I'm going to jump right in and get started talking about how we can farm for clean water. So I'm going to keep it pretty simple, and I'm going to break water pollution basics down into 3 different subjects. I'm going to talk about sedimentation. Then I'm going to tell you guys a little bit about nutrification, which you may or may not have heard of before as eutrophication. And then, like I said, I'll try to keep it simple. So we're going to put everything else into one big bucket that we're going to call other contamination. So starting off with sedimentation, as you can imagine, if you take a farmer's field that looks like this, that's just been plowed, and you have a rainstorm event, something where we get even a medium amount of rain, that sediment, that soil isn't going to stay on the field. It's going to look like, if you give me a click there, Katie, to the next slide. When that water runs off the field, the rain's going to run off and it's going to take some of that dirt with it, right? We call it sediment, we call it soil, but really the simple way to think of it is suspended sediment is dirt in the water. So when the water is moving so fast that the soil particles are still suspended in the water, we refer to that as suspended sediment. So that can alter water chemistry because once the soil particles are in the water, parts of it can start to dissolve. And as you can imagine, it can also start to affect the behavior of aquatic organisms. If you picture yourself as a fish in water that looks kind of that coffee with some cream in it color, or depending on where you live when it rains, you might see your streams turn kind of a clay red color or a deep murky brown color. But if you're a fish trying to find food in that, feeding can be a challenge. If you're an aquatic organism that tries to find mates with visual acuity, mating behaviors are going to become altered. And some other things that can become altered are an organism's ability to find oxygen. So you and I have lungs and we breathe, we get our oxygen through our lungs. Most aquatic organisms have gills. And if you can imagine their gills kind of like the air filter for your engine, if you guys have ever had a car engine that's not running quite so well because the air filter's starting to get clogged up, that can happen to their gills as well when we've got a lot of suspended sediment. And it can become so bad that their gills are so clogged that they can't get oxygen in it, and it can cause fish kill. So one more thing that sedimentation can lead to as an issue when it's no longer suspended is it can begin to affect the habitat. So next slide, please, Katie. So when that suspended sediment when the water starts to slow down, it's no longer moving fast enough to keep all those particles suspended in the water column. And as it starts to settle out, it's going to smother the bottom. And if you look on the left-hand side of the screen here, what you can see in this slide is open cobble, gravel, some small pebbles and stuff like that. When that stuff's clean, there are spaces in between, and that's where a lot of the magic happens in the benthic habitat. Benthic basically means the bottom of a stream or river or a lake or our bays. But when we refer to the benthic habitat, that's the bed of these bodies of water. And you don't want that to be just dirt, mud, and sediment. You want those rocks and you want clean pebbles and things like that, because the spaces in between is where a lot of the critters like mayflies, stoneflies, little worms, bugs, all kinds of stuff are living in there. They're an important part of the ecosystem in these aquatic ecosystems. So we want our soil to stay on the land, underneath vegetation or underneath the leaves or deciduous trees that have dropped if it's the winter time. We don't want that sediment getting washed into our streams. So one other thing that we can refer to when we're talking about sedimentation or a lack thereof, we mentioned that dirty water can make it hard for animals to do things like feed and to mate. It can affect their behavior. One other thing that sediment can affect, when you've got a lot of sediment and muddy water, you're affecting the clarity of the water and the ability of light to transfer through that. that becomes really important for submerged aquatic vegetation. Submerged aquatic vegetation is incredibly important in many of our ecosystems. It's basically a fancy way of saying the plants that live underwater. But they live under there, they grow the same way that our terrestrial plants do, and they need sunlight in order to live, to make food. And when they do that, they're also making oxygen like our terrestrial plants are. So if we don't have light getting through the water column to feed these submerged aquatic vegetation, not only can they die, but they're making less oxygen, even if there's not enough mud in the water to actually make them die. So even a little bit can be bad. So that's a simple explanation of sedimentation and some of the problems that sediment can cause in an aquatic ecosystem. Next, I'm going to talk about nutrification. That's basically when you have too many nutrients in the system. So for anybody that's ever purchased fertilizer, if we're going to talk about nutrients and we're going to talk about water pollution and agriculture, I figured one of the best ways to start to talk about nutrients is to show you guys the label for a bag of fertilizer. So if you look at this label on the left-hand side, toward the top, you'll see 22,314. So those are percentage numbers that refer to the ratio of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium in that bag of fertilizer. So if you've ever heard somebody say they got to run down to the store and pick up a bag of 10-10-10 or 20-10-15, what they're referring to is that the different ratios of nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Now on the right-hand side there, you can see that nitrogen and phosphorus are highlighted in red, and that's because those two nutrients are the two critical nutrients when it comes to both growth as a fertilizer for a terrestrial production system, an agricultural production system, but those are the critical nutrients when we get into an aquatic ecosystem as well. So next slide, please, Katie. So in an aquatic ecosystem, and what we have here is a slide showing you the aquatic ecosystem of the bay. On the left-hand side, we've got healthy levels of nutrients. That means we don't have an excess. We've got limited growth of algae, but we have enough nutrients that we've got some algae and some phytoplankton that can take in those nutrients and grow. And some of those nutrients are going to be taken in by the plants, the submerged aquatic vegetation that you can see growing there as well. That's because the sunlight's able to penetrate through that clear water and provide sunlight to the plants. They can use it and make food. They can make oxygen. They're providing habitat. And what we have is a healthy aquatic community there in our Chesapeake Bay. Now on the right-hand side, you can see what happens when we add nutrient pollution to that aquatic ecosystem. First thing that's going to happen is that algae, they're a real simple form of plant, and they're immediately going to take advantage of any additional nutrients that are presented to them in this aquatic ecosystem. The first thing they're going to do is reproduce like crazy, and they're going to make so many of themselves that they begin to cloud the water, they'll block the sunlight, and then the next thing that they do, because they're reproducing so rapidly, is they will use up all those nutrients and die. They can block so much of the light that they can cause the underwater grasses to die as well. But when the algae die, when we've got a big algae bloom like that, and all those organisms die, bacteria start to feed on those dead algae as they settle to the bottom. So the algae settle out, the bacteria are decaying those dead algae. And what happens is the bacteria use up the oxygen, and there's no plants creating more oxygen. So what we end up with is what we call the dead zone in the bay. It's an oxygen-free zone. So if you give me a click there, Katie, I can show you guys. I downloaded this yesterday from the Virginia Institute of Marine Science. They've got a real interesting website where you can take a look at any given point of what the oxygen levels look like at different parts of the bay. So this shows north is up. You can see the larger tributary coming in there from the west-hand side. That's kind of a mix of blue and green. That's our Potomac River. So you can see that as of yesterday, from the mouth of the Potomac, almost all the way up to the Susquehanna Flats, there in the Susquehanna River, the main channel of the bay, we've got really low oxygen levels, as low as 1 milligram per liter and maybe lower. So on the right-hand side, you can kind of see what some of those effects are when we get into low oxygen levels like that. So unfortunately, when we talk about the dead zone, you can kind of see why. If you see there on the right-hand side, at levels like much of what we're looking at in the bay, mobile fauna, that means fish and crabs and things like that that can swim or crawl and move, have kind of left these areas. And they move out to areas that have more oxygen, but the critters and the plants and stuff that can't move are stuck there, and these low oxygen levels can literally kill them. And I wanted to point out too that nutrification and eutrophication, you know, another word for having excess nutrients in an ecosystem, isn't something that's only that only occurs in our Chesapeake Bay. This is a photo that I took a couple summers ago when I was kayaking on the North Fork of the Shenandoah River here in the Shenandoah Valley where I live. And this is long, stringy filamentous algae that we had during an algae bloom that was late July or early August, as I recall. And you can see that when we talk about healthy aquatic ecosystems and healthy benthic habitat, this really isn't a healthy aquatic ecosystem either. So we can have algae blooms of different types even in freshwater systems. So I mentioned to you guys that I was going to talk about 3 different buckets of pollution. I already covered sedimentation, and I already just got done talking about nutrification. Like I said, I like to keep it simple, so I'd refer to everything else kind of as other. Now that can mean that you've got salts, and that could be road salts that dissolve in the winter, and you know, when they wash off when we're putting salt on our roadways to keep them safe to drive on. Drugs. Those can be drugs that we use for various different purposes, either in agriculture or our own purposes. Toxic metals, PCBs, plastics and microplastics is another pollutant in our waterways that people are becoming more and more aware of. So for now, I'm just going to refer to that as other and say that there are a whole bag of things that can happen due to those contaminants as well. But since we're mainly talking about agriculture, we're going to stay focused on that sediment and nutrient. So I told you guys about sedimentation, nutrification. Now what I'm going to do is tell you guys some basics about using best management practices on farms that can help farmers grow food, make money for themselves, make a living, and help us have clean water. Next slide there, please, Katie. So Katie mentioned that my background's wildlife biology and that I try to look at things from an ecosystem approach. So the way I like to try to explain the use of best management practices, I like to take a step back and say, what's probably the best way that we can use land to produce clean water? So if you think about the cleanest water that you might see, you're probably going to see that in a stream or in a natural ecosystem in an intact forest. You know, we're talking about the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and much of that watershed in a pre-European settlement condition was a deciduous forest. So if we want our streams to be as clean as possible, we're going to try to mimic nature, and we're going to try to mimic our native ecosystems. So how can you do that in a production agricultural system? And I say you can do that on a gradient. So what I mean by that, and I'll explain, I'll give you some examples here on the next slide. So each of these different paragraphs kind of shows you a different example of how you might try to be a farm on a gradient that's far from it looking like a natural ecosystem. And then there toward the bottom of the paragraph, these are things that you can do to work your way toward being more similar to nature. So in nature, you're not going to see a field that gets tilled annually and planted with the same crop every year. We just don't see that. In nature, we see a diversity of species. So to work from that type of system where we begin to see more diversity and work toward a more natural system, you might have tilled crops that are in a rotation where you have corn, then beans. Maybe a farmer uses no-till where he's not disturbing the soil each time that he plants or each time that he harvests. And then you can begin to use combinations of things like cover crops in between our crops, cover crops while we have crops in the ground. People are starting to use things like interseeding devices where they can plant cover crop in between rows of corn and rows of soybean. And then we can work our way into systems that are even more natural, where we've got perennial cover. Those would be grasslands, grass. But if we're still harvesting it for feed or for hay, then that's still technically a cropping system. So we can move from that into a permaculture type of farming situation, which then pushes us into something that looks more like a pasture system. That's where we're growing grasses for forage, which means that we've got animals that are eating that perennial cover. We may not be harvesting it and then giving it to them. We're letting them harvest that food. You want to incorporate a diversity of plant species, again, to try to look like a natural ecosystem. And as far as the management goes, to go from less natural to more natural, it's a lot more natural and more healthy for that perennial cover system, rather than letting the animals have a constant grazing access. And by that I mean where you just take a given number of animals and give them free access to the whole field. If you can divide the field up into smaller units and rotate the animals through so that they only eat a certain amount of vegetation and let the rest of it rest and grow and look more like a natural habitat, like a natural grassland, then you're approaching that natural system. Maybe you can push it even further and begin to incorporate some native warm season grasses. And of course, we always like to talk about how close to nature can we get it. So is there an opportunity on a given farm maybe to do wetland restoration, plant some riparian forest buffers? We love those because they're one of the most efficient best management practices for producing clean water. And can you plant some native species into these areas and maybe fix the hydrology where it might have been altered in the past? So when I say you mimic nature on a gradient, you kind of have to ask each farmer where they are, what the farm looks like, and where they want to be, and where each particular farm fits. Each farm's going to have a different soil type, a different lay of the land, and get a different amount of sun and rain depending on where it is. But so you've got to ask, where does it fit, and what are the best management options for a farmer to use that land for production? So now some specific examples of best management practices that we can use to reduce sediment. These are things we can do to help keep that soil on the ground and out of our waterways. So I mentioned that we can try to disturb the soil less. The less we disturb the soil, the less likely it is to run off in a rain event. So using no-till practices like seed drills is a wonderful way to begin to disturb the soil less and keep more of it on our fields where we need them. Planting on the contour is another method where you plant your crops in rows that follow an elevation line. And you guys may have seen this. It's kind of like terracing, where you try to keep the water and the soil, the nutrients and the plants all planted along one elevation line so that when the water flows downhill, it's got to flow across those rows and give all those rows of crops an opportunity to absorb that water and to absorb the nutrients and sediment associated with it. Another thing we can do after we harvest the crop is leave some crop residue. So an example of that on the right-hand side of this photo that you can see some of the residue that's left over from that previous crop. One thing that we can do to make that even better, rather than just having some cover left from the previous crop that's there to help protect the soil, we can plant cover crops. So there's a cover crop mixture on your left-hand side of your photo, and you can see the difference and imagine the difference that it would make if there were to be a rain event or a large windstorm that came through. How much more soil is going to be held in place by those cover crops versus what you can see on the rest of those fields. So some additional things you can do is buffer your field edges. That means plant a vegetative buffer in between the field and the streams. And that can be a simple grass buffer, or it could be something great like a riparian forested buffer as well. That's going to slow down that overland flow and keep the sediment in place. So one more important thing we can do to keep sediment out of our streams is to exclude livestock from the streams. As you can imagine, as the livestock go in and out of streams, and if they stand around in there, their hooves disturb the stream bed and they disturb the stream banks as they come and go. And that's a real easy opportunity to put sediment into our streams that we can avoid by keeping the livestock out of those streams. So those are some examples of what we can do to help keep the sediment out of the streams. And next, we talked about nutrients being an additional pollution. So how can we keep nutrients on the field and out of our waterways? Well, you're going to follow the 4 R's. The 4 R's mean that you're going to use the right type of fertilizer when you put fertilizer down for your crop, and you're going to put it down at the right time. So an example of that might be that you've got a farm where you've got some livestock, might be poultry, it might be some cows, but if you can collect that manure and store it and save it, it does have nutrients in it. It's got organic matter in it, and it can make a great soil amendment and fertilizer. So that might be the right type of fertilizer, but you're going to need to put that down at the right time. So you want to put it down soon before it's going to be needed by the crop. As an example of bad timing, you wouldn't want to spread manure in winter when the fields are covered with snow. There's no opportunity for those nutrients to enter the soil and become an active part of the soil ecosystem and let those nutrients be taken up by the crop. So you also want to put down the right amount of fertilizer. Now, something that probably a few homeowners here and there are guilty of is this idea that if you put down 1 pound per acre of nutrients, then putting down 2 pounds per acre of nutrients is going to make your grass grow twice as much. It's going to look twice as good. So you don't want to do that. You want to figure out the needs of your crop, whether that crop is hay, a seed crop, grain crop, whatever it's going to be. And you want to put only the right amount to grow the crop that you want to harvest. You also want to put that in the right place. Spreading it all over the field might make sense if you're trying to grow a hay and grow a crop, but there are opportunities for certain types of crop, such as if you're growing corn, to do what's called nitrogen side dress, where you come through at a critical time in the growth of that corn, right before it starts to grow and get ready to grow its ears of corn. And before it really starts to take off, it gets really hungry for nitrogen. We can come by and use what's called nitrogen side dress to apply that nitrogen right at the roots of the corn, and it's that much more able to take it up. So one additional thing, now we mentioned this when we were talking about sedimentation, but another way to keep the nutrients on the field is to keep the soil on the field. So a lot of the nutrients are adsorbed or adsorbed to the soil particles. One example of that is that most of our phosphorus pollution that goes into our waterways occurs during events where we've got sediment that's also washing into our waterways. Roughly 80% or more often of the phosphorus pollution is transported into our aquatic ecosystems, adsorbed to soil particles. If we can keep the soil in the field, that's another way that we can keep the nutrients in the field. Now, Austin's going to mention one more way that we can keep nutrients on the field and out of our waterways during his presentation, but I'm going to leave it with that. So we're going to get into the bucket of other stuff when it comes to pollutants a little bit. And I'm just going to real quickly say that we're all familiar with the fact that farmers sometimes need to use pesticides like herbicides, insecticides, fungicides. And in general, what we're going to say is these can be important tools to an agricultural producer. Only use them when necessary rather than trying to use them in a prophylactic manner. And if you do need to use these products, we recommend that you follow the label instructions so that they do the job you need. Again, much like our fertilizer, you don't want to apply more hoping that you'd get the job done when applying more of these can be problematic. So additional pollutants that might fall into the other category that you might see it coming from an agricultural operation might be the use of drugs. An example of that is if you've got some animals that get sick and you need to give them antibiotics, you might want to think about where you're going to have those animals until they process and pass that antibiotic, that drug through their system. An example of that is a lot of antibiotics, while they may stay in the animal system for 12, 24, maybe 48 hours while the drugs are doing what they need to within the animal, antibiotics are specifically made to kill bacteria. So a lot of people don't realize that those antibiotic chemicals pass through the animal. They pass through you and I too when we take them, and they can stay active in the environment for 10, sometimes 12, 14 days, depending on what those drugs are. So keep that in mind and consider where you're going to have your animals during and after the period that you're giving them some medications, because those medications may pass through and enter into the ecosystem. One last example that I'll talk about is salts, and we don't tend to see those being too much of a problem, but if you've got a system where you're relying on irrigation, what can happen over time is you're pumping water from surface waters or from deep wells that might have some salts in the water. Over time, what we then see is evapotranspiration lets the water leave that system, but you can see a buildup of salts in some of those soils. And then when we get rain events, those salts can wash off into our waterways. So not a complete list, obviously, of other things that we might see as far as contaminants, but those are some examples for you to think about. So I'm going to kind of say again, how can farmers feed us, make a living, have a productive lifestyle and make a profit, and protect water? Then I'm going to say the best way in concept for them to do that is to mimic nature with best management practices.
Awesome.
Thanks, Katie. I was going to say, I'll turn it back over to you.
Sounds good. All right. Well, thank you so much for that, Matt. We already have a couple questions that have come in for you, but we'll save those for the end of Austin's presentation during the Q&A section. If you do have any additional questions for Matt, please don't hesitate to put those into the Q&A portion of the webinar. It's down at the bottom of your screen. I'd also like to kind of mention that if you're interested in doing if you're wanting to get more involved and wanting to be kind of part of the restoration efforts towards clean water, becoming a CBF member is really a great opportunity for people. There is going to be a link in the chat for actually people to get more information on getting memberships. There's also the legislative session is actually going on right now. And so if you would like to reach out to a legislator to know that this is important and these are clean water is an important topic for you to kind of pursue, that would be a really great help. And there should be a link in the chat for that as well. I now would like to switch it over to Matt's partner in crime, Austin Horn, who is CBF Restoration Specialist. Austin works with agricultural producers and landowners to improve water quality and increase farm production through improved grazing practices. Austin grew up on his family's farm and commercial beef cattle farm in the Shenandoah Valley and lives there with his family now. And so take it away, Austin.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you, everybody, this evening for joining us and listening in. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some best management practices that are associated with livestock operations and also the benefits of rotational grazing. This picture here is a very common landscape for most of Virginia. When we come out to a farm, myself or Matt or somebody else with the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, somebody with the Natural Resources Conservation Services, or the other local soil and water conservation districts, we go out to a farm, we start talking to the landowner or the farmer, and we try to figure out what are the resource concerns that are on his property or their property. One of the obvious ones in this picture would be cattle standing in the stream. So those cattle will be up on the landscape, and when they come down to drink, their hooves are eroding the stream bank, and then they're also usually defecating in there in the surface water. And then you can also see where the stream banks had sloughed off because there's not enough vegetation there to hold them. Something else to notice here is that even though it's an early spring day here, but you can see the dark green clumps of grass. That's actually manure piles from the previous year. So you can tell by looking at this field, there's some nutrient issues. The field could potentially needs more nutrients so it can be more productive and do a better job of raising livestock. So after I meet with a landowner and we go over these different resource concerns, then we go back and we come up with a conservation plan. This is an example of a conservation plan where we went out, we looked at looked at the farm with many other partners, like I've mentioned, and then also sat down with the landowner and came up with the best way to correct as many of the issues on their operation that we can, so that we can improve water quality, soil quality, and the overall health of the animals. This can be a very complicated process potentially. This is why it's really good to work with technical service providers. Just for this one operation, we ended up having to use 5 different pots of funding to correct all the different issues that were on the farm so we can improve water quality. One of the first things that we do when we go on to a new farm that has surface water on it, we usually look at doing stream exclusion. This is excluding livestock from the surface water by building a fence usually. This is usually the first step in conservation planning. This can actually be a big benefit to a farmer because usually if a cow is getting ready to have a calf, they usually find their way closer to water. And this actually has some risk of the calf after being born potentially getting stuck in the mud or in the stream banks, and some other issues with that. So excluding livestock from the stream can actually have benefits for the producer. And then once we go and decide we exclude the livestock from the surface water, then we have to go and provide clean water back to them. Katie? This usually entails of installing a watering system. So this usually starts with putting in a new well or tying into an existing well on the property, installing watering lines, and installing watering troughs. This is an example of a frost-free watering trough. One of the big advantages of installing a new watering system is livestock do not like to travel more than 1,000 feet for grazing. So we can go and situate the watering troughs in locations where they can better utilize the rest of the pastures. And we can also have them, by locating the watering troughs in different locations, we can actually have them redistribute their nutrients farther away from the surface water so we don't have to worry about any polluted runoff running back into the creeks. And this is a frost-free trough, so a benefit to the producer is if it is installed correctly, this watering trough will not freeze in the wintertime. So this is one less thing that a producer has to worry about during the winter. And then also, there's been many studies that have shown that by providing clean, cool water for livestock can actually increase weight gains. So this actually has an animal health aspect to it by providing better water. And then also by providing better water, this can usually cut down on veterinarian bills. The biggest way for livestock to spread bacteria and other diseases usually is from the oral fecal pathway. So if a cow is standing in the water and defecates and there's a cow downstream, it can drink it. So by providing water that is clean and cool, this can reduce vet bills as well. Okay. So usually the streams are located and we still need to get each side of the stream to actually be able to farm both sides. So as you can see here, there's a denuded area where the farmer had been driving in and out of the barn to try to check his cattle or bring the cattle in. So what we would end up doing is coming back later using cost share funds and installing a stream crossing. This is a picture of after the stream crossing was installed. This was actually a culverted crossing, but any engineered crossing can work well. This cuts down on the amount of erosion and also the amount of sediment that is brought into the water when vehicle traffic, tractors, or animals are crossing. And then also, this actually helps the farmer as well because then they have a alleyway to get the animals into the barn, and it's less stressful on the animals and easier on the farmer to get the animals into the facilities as needed. This is another picture of the same operation. They're just looking at different angles. So you can see there, before we put in the stream crossing, the animals had full access to the stream, the denuded creek banks. Now we went and put in a hardened pathway and a fence that allowed the farmer to move the animals to and from the barn. which would cut down on the erosion by having a hardened surface. Another interesting aspect of this project was that we actually installed gutters and downspouts on the barn. There's a lot of roof area, and it could have potentially created other resource concerns if they were not addressed. Now, with the added benefit of the gutter and downspouts, we can actually direct all the rainwater from those roofs into the creek in a way where they will not erode any of the stream bank and cut down on erosion that way. Go ahead, Katie. All these best management practices can be very expensive. So the Chesapeake Bay Foundation, along with working with Virginia Cooperative Extension, we have tried to look at some other alternatives to provide water for livestock. This is the mobile solar watering system that CBF owns, and we actually loan this out to different producers around the Shenandoah Valley for them to use. It's actually pumping water out of a spring creek behind us, coming up here, filling up the reservoirs on the trailer, and then we gravity feed it back down to the trough. This was primarily designed in thinking of rented land. 50% of the farmland in Virginia is rented land, meaning that the person farming it is not the person that owns it. And most of the leased land is in a year-to-year verbal agreement, so it leaves very little interest in the farmer to want to actually invest in infrastructure that they will not be guaranteed to use for years to come. So this is an option where they can use temporary step-in equipment and exclude livestock from surface water and provide an off-stream source of watering without having to risk the loss of their investment. They can always pack this unit up and take it to another farm and continue to use it if they lose their lease. That was just some of the basic best management practices. Now I'm going to get into speaking a little bit more on rotational grazing. As Matt mentioned, rotational grazing is basically taking a large field and dividing it with interior fencing to create paddocks so that the livestock can be managed and moved from field to field to allow adequate rest to grow additional forage. This is a definition of management intensive grazing from Jim Gersh that is just a fabulous definition here. A flexible approach to rotational grazing management where the animal nutrient demands through the grazing season is balanced with forage supply and available forage is allocated based on animal requirements. This is very important when trying to graze throughout the season. We need to be very flexible. We have very many variables when it comes to growing grass and managing livestock, such as drought and rainy season. So we have to have a flexible plan on grazing our livestock to overcome these challenges. It's also very important to make sure our pastures are high enough quality so that the animals can get all the nutrients they need to continue to do their jobs, such as put on weight for consumption or having offspring. And it's also very important to make sure that you have the right number of livestock within the operation so that you have enough livestock on the operation to maintain adequate forage throughout the season. You don't want to have too many animals and not enough land so that then there's not enough feed available for them. One way of thinking about this would be like having a dinner party with about 20 people invited and only showing up with enough food for 10. It's not going to go very well, and not everybody is going to get full. So if they did this continuously, they'll actually lose body score and lose condition and potentially won't be very good animals for keeping within the grazing system. All right, this is one of my favorite studies. It's actually happened a long time ago. It's from 1961. Basically what they did, they took 4 different clumps of tall fescue grass, which is our predominant pasture forage species here in Virginia. And over the course of a year, they clipped each grass clump once a month to a certain residual height. The one on the far left was an unclipped fescue clump. The second one was clipped to 5 inches once a month. The third one was clipped to 3 inches once a month, and the last one was clipped to 1.5 inches once a month. The fescue that was clipped to 5 inches would basically be how the forage would react under rotational grazing. This would be allowing the cattle to graze it down to a certain height, and then moving them to another paddock and having enough forage for them to in another paddock, and then allowing this pasture to rest. The pasture that is clipped continuously down to 1.5 inches per month, this would represent basically what's happening in a continuously grazed situation, where the animals are continually coming back and eating that new growth. And you can see what it's doing there. So each little blade of grass, you have to think of it as a solar panel. Each blade of grass then catches the light, makes photosynthesis, and stores energy in the above ground and the below ground portion of in the roots. So if there's not enough solar panel there, it can't be expected to grow grass as well. So by leaving more post residue after grazing, we can actually grow more grass throughout the grazing season. So that increases forage availability within the grazing system, which is also something that works, is very well needed then during drought. By having more grass available on top to make energy and more roots below ground, the longer, more dense roots do a better job of going back down, lowering the soil profile and pulling up needed nutrients and moisture during drought, so we can increase the water availability within our pastures. The 5-inch clip pastures also reduces erosion. Those big roots, they do a very good job of holding a lot of soil in place, but not only by the root aspect, but also with the above ground portion of the forage. Each blade of grass will actually slow down the speed of rain falling onto the pasture, so it reduces erosion and gully and real erosion there. And then also by having a dense sod such as this, it will stop erosion as well from if it started from upland even more. This is actually very similar to your common home lawn. Potentially, if you continually to mow it too close, that it would actually, you're stressing the roots, and then potentially you'll see more yellowing and browning in the summertime during a drought. Where if potentially you mow a little higher and has a healthier root structure, you potentially stay greener and see a more healthier lawn during a drought. Katie? All right, this is an example. Go back one, please. This is actually a farm that's here in Shenandoah Valley. You see the red line is the farm boundary, and the blue circle is a spring-fed pond. So within this operation, it was a continuously grazed operation. The livestock only traveled in the upper left-hand portion of the farm because that's where the water source was. They very rarely ever went to the southeast side of the property because they didn't want to travel that far for water. Another thing is here, if you see the dotted yellow lines, that's actually how they got the livestock from the pasture back to the barn if they ever need to be worked or sorted. It was a large undertaking where they actually had to drive the cattle through the woods and through the field, and it took a lot of extra help. It was very stressful on the livestock, and it was very stressful on the farmers. So, go ahead, Kate. They decided to implement a rotational grazing system on this operation. So they first started off and excluded livestock from the initial pond. Then they installed interior fencing, which is the yellow lines, which created 11 new paddocks on the farm. Each of the other little blue dots are all watering troughs that were added. Each one of these watering troughs can now serve as a field, and each one is located so that they can be within a set distance for grazing for increasing forage utilization. Something else that they did here that worked out great is they installed a travel lane for the livestock. The red line is a 50-foot wide grass travel lane that goes from paddock to paddock. This way, one person can easily go back there and open a gate, call the livestock, and they will come out into the travel lane, and they can get them to the barn or get them to another field within the grazing system. This is one huge benefit of rotational grazing. As the producer works with the livestock more, the cattle become familiar with them, and then also see that the farmer, and when it's time to move them, they see it as a benefit. So they actually want to move to the next field because they know they're getting good grass to eat. So this makes it less stressful when handling animals, and it also makes it less stressful for the producer. And with rotational grazing, the biggest benefit overall is extending the grazing season. This is really important. There's been numerous studies that have been done. Basically, the difference between a profitable farm and an unprofitable farm is the being able to lower and manage your feeding expenses in the wintertime. So by having a managed grazing system with a proper number of cattle, most producers can extend their grazing season and save cost within their operation by grazing longer into the season. So it's a huge benefit. It's good for soil quality, water quality, herd health, and it's good for the bottom line of farmers while they're trying to improve their operation. All right, this is just a pretty picture from my family's operation. Thank you very much for joining me this evening, and now Matt's going to finish up with the presentation.
All right, thanks a lot, Alston. So I'm just going to jump back in here, and I showed you guys a slide of the dead zone that's been caused by the additional nutrients going into the Chesapeake Bay. And I wanted to talk a little bit about progress over time that we have seen in people using these BMPs and kind of trying to work our way to that 2025 benchmark. If you guys are familiar with the Chesapeake Clean Water Blueprint, that's our plan to get the bay clean and down to the numbers that you can see. If you look on the right-hand side, you'll see each of those different sectors come down to a dot at 2025. And if you add all those numbers up, together they meet the total maximum daily load recommended as what we've got to get our nitrogen contributions to the bay down to in order to have a healthy bay. So you can see that in the past, the wastewater sector has made some tremendous advances. If you look back toward 2009, 2010, then you see some real reductions in the amount of nitrogen loads that are delivered to the bay by the time we get to 2015. And then again, some significant reductions into 2017. But if you take a look at each of these different sectors, the progress that we need to make as far as reducing our additional nitrogen contributions to the bay, you can see that we need to take agriculture from, it's about 11.5 million pounds per year to about 7.5 million pounds per year by 2025. So we need to ask farmers to implement more of these BMPs. And fortunately, if you give me the next slide here, Katie. One of the reasons why agriculture is being asked to reduce its contributions of nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment to the bay is simply because agriculture is the second largest land use in the state of Virginia. And that's true for most of the bay states. So aside from forested habitat, the next most common land use is agriculture. So even if you only have a little bit of pollution coming from each of those acres, it adds up significantly when you've got millions of acres that are being used for agricultural purposes. Now, one of the benefits to trying to reduce our nitrogen reduction by asking farmers to use BMPs is that these best management practices are some of our least expensive ways to reduce nitrogen contributions to the bay. This slide that we're looking at here is a visual representation of the dollars per pound reduced using each of these different best management practice types. So I've got them color coded. I apologize if anybody is red-green or blue-green colorblind. I didn't think about that until just now. I apologize to my wife who's red-green. Forest or grass buffers, barnyard runoff controls, like what Alston showed you with the installation of gutters, row crop to pasture conversion, those are $1, $4, $10 per pound reduced. That's relatively efficient compared to some of the BMPs that we see on developed lands, like stormwater detention, bioswale, that is roughly 50 times more expensive per pound reduced than a forest buffer is, or stormwater treatment. And then we get into some really expensive BMPs like stream restoration and impervious surface reduction and things like that in our developed habitats. So not only is it less expensive, but there's an awful lot of low-hanging fruit if we want to ask farmers to step up and help us out cleaning up the Chesapeake Bay. So if you give me the next slide, Katie. You might say, that's fantastic. I appreciate all the information that you've given me this evening, but what can I do to make a difference? Well, some things that you can do to make a difference are try to get your food from farms that you know are using best management practices. I don't know how it all works in Pennsylvania, New York, Maryland. I do know that you want to try to find pasture-raised protein if you can. There is a publication called Amazing Grazing that publishes farms that either direct market or make their meats and proteins available, and they produce those on pasture. So it's Amazing Grazing is all about proteins produced on pasture. In Virginia, we have the Resource Management Plan certified farms, so you can look for farms that are using those or are certified. There are also Clean Water Farm Award farms, and those are farms that have been given an award by their local soil and water conservation district for being exemplary farms and using these sustainable best management practices in their agricultural operations. So you can look for those signs. Another thing you can do to help reduce pollution is to eat locally. The closer you can eat to home, the better. Growing food from your own backyard is wonderful, but if you can't do that, maybe think about joining a CSA, that's Community Supported Agriculture. And one more thing that I can certainly say is vote with your wallet. So if you value clean water, try to find people who are farming in a clean way and be willing to pay for that value-added product. If you want clean water, pay a little bit more for that value-added food, and we all see the return on investment from that. So I think I'm going to leave it there and turn it back over to you, Katie.
Awesome, guys. Well, thank you guys so much. That was an excellent presentation. I really appreciate you guys taking your time tonight and sharing the knowledge that you guys have, and all the hard work that you guys have actually done to help kind of get the bay in the right place. We don't have much time for Q&A. Like, we have about time for about 3 questions, but don't worry, we will answer most of everybody's questions, if not all of the questions, in the next day or 2, and we'll email you directly with any of your answers. So I already have a couple ready picked out for you guys. Matt, the first one is going to be directed to you. It's from Bonnie. And her question is nutrient pollution the reason why some of the northernmost parts of the bay, like Elk River, are so cloudy and muddy, or could there be other reasons?
Depending on the cloudiness, it could be nutrient pollution. So when you get a big algae bloom, it actually gets a real cloudy look to it, and it doesn't have the same color as just the mud from a rain event. So if what you're seeing is a real cloudy kind of contamination, it sounds like it probably is from nutrient contamination. Although specifically, I wouldn't be able to tell you without being familiar with the rain event and the specific location.
Cool. And then Austin, this one is going to be for you. Like the tax breaks homeowners receive for certain improvements, do farmers receive something similar to create the beneficial systems Austin mentioned?
Yes, it's a little different. So basically, it's considered the cost share program. And there's assistance then for, you know, getting assistance for a watering system, the stream exclusion, the fence. Basically, it's paid on a linear for a percentage. But then there's other programs such as like Matt was talking about with the nutrient management plans, where they can pay a little bit per acre for having a nutrient management plan and following it. So it's a little different, but there is some compensation.
And that was from Monet. I'm sorry, I did not mention her name. We have time for one more. Just one, Dick Williams wanted to kind of ask the question, might you speak a bit about conflicts between sustainable and traditional farming methods, including pesticide spraying? Are they resolved with any frequency? If yes, how?
I would say individual conflicts, that, you know, say if you've got a sustainable farm and maybe a neighbor who's trying to use traditional methods, there are options that you can use, such as contacting the Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services to help try to resolve those conflicts. And sometimes we can just talk to our local technical service providers. That might be Virginia Conservation Extension. It could be partners like Chesapeake Bay Foundation, Soil and Water Conservation Districts, or NRCS, where we're not really paid to do conflict resolution, but oftentimes we can help both of those farmers come up with options to use best management practices where they can both continue to farm the way that they want to farm in a successful way.
Awesome. Well, that looks like about the time that we have tonight, guys. Like I said, there's a lot of questions that have actually been answered or asked in this Q&A. So thanks so much for using that. We will get to your questions in the next day or two and address any concerns that you may have or any additional information that you may need. Like I said, we'll be following up an email. The email will also contain the links that we have spoken about through the presentation. Please feel free to email me or Alice if you have any questions. Keep in mind that we're doing the Brock Learning Series on a monthly basis during COVID. It's going to be webinar based. Next month is going to be October 15th, and we'll be discussing flooding, climate change, and nature-based solutions local governments are starting to implement. The link in the registration is going to, there'll be a link in the chat box, and then there'll also be a link in the follow-up email. Thank you all so much for joining us, and look forward to seeing you guys next month. Have a great afternoon and evening. Bye.
Thanks so much, everybody.